It's July 2003, Bruce at Giant Stadium. This is Remember That Game, the podcast about sporting events ish that take you on a journey and maybe chart the path of the zeitgeist. I'm your host, Thomas Emerick, and my guest is Nick Corasaniti, New York Times political reporter and author of I Don't Want to Go Home, The Oral History of the Stone Pony. Now out on paperback, as folks can see on what will be the YouTube feed. Nick, are you ready to traverse from the Jersey Shore up through the Meadowlands and through time?
Yep, right up Highway 9.
And the Stone Pony subject of your book, a New Jersey cultural institution and a home field of sorts for Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band coming up in the early 70s prior to the opening and through the opening of Giant Stadium in 76, which becomes another venue for legendary concerts. How crucial was geographic location at that time in incubating sports fandom and a music scene where you grew up?
I mean, the interesting thing about Asbury Park is that, like, if you were to go back to the 50s and 60s, it was like the most happening town, right? You had a bar on every corner, and every bar had music. It was mostly bar bands, it was top 40, it was cover, but there was still that vibe, right? There was that scene that's so critical to sustaining, kind of where artists flock to. After the race riots in 1970, the town changed, but those bars were still the same. They were still there. They still needed bands to play. And so what you saw was a little bit of like an evolution with music there. And it was in such an interesting place because it was in between New York and Philly, kind of equidistant. So people had been passing through for ages playing at Convention Hall. I think like the word is everyone from from the Stones to Black Sabbath, except the Beatles and Hendrix, have played at Convention Hall. So it was known as like a stopping point, right? As an in between. And then under that was this whole scene of different bars and musicians. And so when the kind of bar scene changes a little bit, that's when the music scene comes alive, and you see a place like the Stone Pony start to attract new artists and new people to come play a new kind of music. And so that geographic location being in between New York and Philly, and then also everything that happened in that geographic region in that era, kind of allowed it all to snowball into like this perfect perfect storm of music and art and culture.
And Giant Stadium up northwest there from Asbury Park, essentially home turf for Bruce in 85, touring Born in the USA. Put several shows there and then closed out Giant Stadium in '09 with his dedicated song Wrecking Ball. Then seeding to the new MetLife Stadium where the Giants and Jets now play. But why does Bruce's summer '03 residency for the Rising Tour carry the most personal meaning for you and a lot of folks in the tri state?
Well, I mean, do you have because there's so much to go through there. Um, for me, that's my first Springsteen show. I was in high school. I had a torn Achilles. I was crutching around the Giants Stadium parking lot, which anyone who's ever been to a Giants tailgate knows feels like a mile-long trek. So on crutches in 90-degree heat, when they were telling me in their golf carts that like I wasn't worthy of a of a ride for handicap access. Um, Started my first Springsteen concert experience, and I didn't really know what to anticipate. I grew up in the punk scene in New Jersey, which was in all of the little towns surrounding Giant Stadium and Asbury Park.
And Meadowlands is technically a swamp, right? You're like
Yes.
trudging through the swamp, okay, on a
Oh
torn
yeah,
Achilles.
exactly. Literally behind the parking lot in like lot J is like a marshland. So if you're in the back of the Giant Stadium tailgate, especially the old Giant Stadium, like you just looked off into swamps, or as Bruce would say, the swamps of Jersey. So I finally get to my seat. I'm not sure what to expect. And out of nowhere, he comes on stage, just does a knee slide across the stage. It's instant energy. It's not this slow build. It's like a firework. And I'll never forget that moment because it was just kind of like a realization of recognizing an artist that you'd grown up listening to, had kind of loomed large growing up in New Jersey, but you didn't really have that connection to until you experience it live. And so that was me. But the thing about the Rising tour is, that was kind of, it wasn't the first tour back with the E Street Band. They'd done their reunion tour, but it was the first time with new music. And, there's a lot of urban legends about how the Rising came to be. Someone yells out the window at Bruce, we need you now, post 9/11, and everything that kind of came into that record. But it really resonated in the area that was most impacted by 9/11, right? So that record and that tour meant a little bit more to the folks in Giant Stadium than it did in Tulsa. And that's just because that's, where we were. So I think it had like a really compounding impact, both musically and regionally.
Yeah, and I imagine you'd heard so much from people who had seen Bruce at Giant Stadium over the years. Had probably a lot of anticipation for that show.
Endless, right? And like, I have a very big family on both sides. I'm Irish and Italian, so you can imagine how that grows. And we were all going together, and like the anticipation was building so much, especially for so many. We had never heard the song "The Rise" live yet, so like for everything that song represented and for what it did for the area, to then be able to experience that kind of anthemic strings that start, that arpeggiated chord that slowly builds, and then his voice kind of comes in. Like, you can get goosebumps just thinking about it based on what the record sounds like. Now imagine that live, imagine that for the first time, imagine that in an area that's still pretty raw, and like in that old stadium too, right? Which wasn't um I don't know how to say this without insulting the new one, but like it was a little more organic. It was a concrete block, right? It felt like a thing that was just blue collar, rough and tumble, and like you all belong there together instead of fied whatever's it's in the new one. So mix all that together, and it's kind of a perfect combination.
The old Giant Stadium, and also a different era of ticket prices, I imagine, as well. But some of the most bootlegged shows at Giant Stadium from '76 to 2009 were probably when you were quite young. You two's tour dates for Joshua Tree and Octung Baby. You mentioned the Stones coming through. Pink Floyd had a famous early '90s set, the first Joel and John face to face. And outside of the Rising tour, my sense is since the early '90s, it's been Madison Square Garden across the Hudson getting all the shine over the past 3 decades for legendary concerts and games. But are there any other games or shows in your Giant Stadium going years that you think deserve some flowers?
Ooh, well, if we're getting into sports, then absolutely. In terms of concerts, um, the Live 8, in 2000,
Was that 7,
yeah, or
8?
2007. Um, that was a pretty monumental moment for a couple reasons because, there hadn't been a global music effort of that type in decades, right? It was very popular with Farm Aid and Live Aid and Hands Across the World and all the different, kind of movements happening in the 80s and 90s and even late 70s. Had kind of taken a rest until that came back. And, everything that went into that at Giant Stadium was a pretty interesting experience, right? Like or I think it was Roger Waters, wasn't Pink Floyd, but he brings the pig and it's flying around, and policed all three of them on stage at once. And before that was like Kelly Clarkson and Akon, so it was a mix that was really kind of interesting, and it showed. I mean, I think the interesting thing about like when Giant Stadium goes in from a music point of view is that it gives New Jersey a mega venue for the biggest artists ever, right? They had different stadiums. Bruce had played the Brendan Byrne Arena and a few other places, but there wasn't that like 60 to 70,000 place until that comes in. So I think that changes. I think there's a pretty famous concert by the Who and the Quadrophenia tour there. I wasn't there, but there's a lot of those kind of stories that had built up. Sports wise, the I think the single best sporting event I've ever attended in person was in the 2007 season when the Giants, eventually win the Super Bowl and they beat the undefeated Pats. Everyone forgets that in the last week of that season, meaningless game, except for the Pats to go
Patriots.
undefeated in the regular season, it meant nothing for the Giants, right? So my buddy and I got tickets handed to us by someone who's like, this game's meaningless. Like, I'm not going to go. No one's going to go. It's a waste. We're like, we'll take anything. So we went, and that ends up being and Coughlin's like, I'm going to start all my starters like this for history. I want to do this. And so it was an incredible game. It was an offensive battle. I think the final score was in the 30s. And the Giants lost on, in my opinion, still a very questionable offensive pass interference call on Monty Toomer, which I'm still not over. But that game was just an incredible game to witness. And then when you think about everything that season and the historic Super Bowl, like that was the first moment that we all like allowed ourselves to believe, right? That this team could do something special.
Coughlin's like, no, we're gonna go out and put some doubt in their head. And the,
Yeah,
the 16-0 Patriots.
it was incredible. And like the Giants came out fighting. And that was the first time that Brady was on his back more than he wasn't, right? In that game. And it's because the Giants D line, which is what won them that Super Bowl, was just unstoppable. And we were able to see it. And like, Toomer and Plaxico really came into their own. It was like Eli was finding his groove. Because when Eli was in his groove, he was one of the three best quarterbacks ever. It just unfortunately regular groove. But in that playoff run, that's kind of, I think that's where that started. It wasn't that wild card game against, or not wild card, but divisional against the Cowboys. It was that first game. And the stadium, despite it being a lot of secondhand tickets for people who didn't think it would matter, like the stadium was going nuts. And I just, I remember like chants as we were walking out and everything. So that like, when Bruce writes the song Wrecking Ball, and he sings about like we're Giants played the game and everyone cheers, like my mind goes to that game.
Yeah, a song for the closing out of Giant Stadium. The bar's raised for when RFK gets demolished. They have the high bar to clear across the division. But yeah, we as Giants fans will also always have the 41-0 against the Vikings, January 2001, NFC title, cold swirling winds. Up to that point, going into '03, though, we'd come off a pretty brutal wild card loss to the Niners. Historic comeback in San Francisco. That's tough. Eli has a lot of great playoff games on the road, like in Green Bay, in Dallas. He closed out Cowboy Stadium. That was his song for them. And we all remember the Super Bowls and the domes against Brady and Belichick. Um, the Jets, New York Jets, they also play in Giant Stadium. I don't know how you do it. You play in a place called Giant Stadium all those years, but not nearly as many good memories. But coming into '03, their fans had their own 41-0 playoff beatdown of Peyton Manning and the Colts. Uh, Meanwhile, the Giants are coming off that heartbreaking loss in the wild card. Do you remember feeling particularly bullish on the Giants that summer? And what was it like being a sports fan in North Jersey? You got the Eagles, Jets, and Giants, all actually pretty feisty contenders at that point in time.
I mean, I think the scarring of the 2001 Super Bowl loss amongst like a lot of Giants fans in the area was so deep that it was hard to have faith for a while, right? And like Eli was this big exciting, signing, the new era, and those first few years showed flashes of promise, but then there'd be like the playoff game against the Panthers that like, went to absolute hell at home in Giant Stadium. So, there was always that like that memory of like we were so close but so far because of how bad the Ravens beat us. And then all the fits and starts there that, and also don't forget how like kind of good the Yankees were at that point and how much they were dominating the region's sports discussions with like the legendary rivalry with the Red Sox, that it kind of like both papered over and absorbed so much of Northern Jersey sports fandom. Even the Nets were interesting. That was like the Jason Kidd era and everything.
Yeah.
So it didn't really permeate. I don't think we like believed until all of a sudden we did. And for me, it was that meaningless last game of the season in like semi-frigid Giant Stadium temperatures. And one of my favorite things that I remember about that game was my buddy and I drove. We didn't have any kind of tailgate, but we brought marinated London broil and Heineken mini keg. And we would just go to people that had grills and be like, "We'll pour you a beer if you let us grill our steak on here." And they
Good
did. And
work.
everyone was like, "Watch out for us today. Watch out for us." Felt like Kevin Millar in that famous
Yeah.
uh, Red Sox documentary. Like, watch out for us, and that's when we could start to believe.
Don't let us knock Brady on his back too much today because it's going to
That's
be a
right. Doesn't matter.
it's going to be a problem in a few weeks. And the Giants team gets rolling. In '03, it's interesting. It's like the late Jim Fossil, Kerry Collins era. Ends up having disappointing season there, but I think they're like 25-1, 20-1 Super Bowl odds. Not bad. The Jets coming in had the third best odds out of the AFC, and they meet in their 2003 their annual preseason tune-up the same week Bruce's Rising Tour residency at Giant Stadium resumes for its August leg of shows. And because it's the Jets, this is the one where Chad Pennington dislocated his wrist, and poof, the Jets go from one of the AFC favorites to last in their division. Right around Labor Day tends to be a nightmare for Jets fans, but do they have much traction on Jersey Shore, Asbury Park, North Jersey out to Passaic, or are those all staunchly Giants strongholds?
No, I think it's a pretty even mix. I mean, you definitely see more Giants flags than you see Jets flags here, and there's a good mix of Eagles too. We're Asbury Park and Bruce Springsteen hometown country freehold area. We're kind of right in the dividing line of whether you become New York or Philly fans. But it's definitely like 60-40 New York here. I'd say you see a lot more Giants than Jets. I think there's a lot of Jets in Manhattan and outer boroughs too in New York. The Times actually did like a pretty interesting fan map like a few years ago where they like mapped out where different fans are. Like I know plenty of Jets fans, but I also know more Giants fans because that's how I'm gonna associate. And I got nothing against Jets fans, and I'll root for them when they're not playing the Giants. But you know, it's different.
Yeah, and the Jets fans, I assume their stronghold is, yeah, you mentioned, but also Long Island. They or Queens, is Queens the biggest concentration?
It is. Well, so it is. And the interesting thing, I'm just citing like the Times of story here. But there's the Mets, Jets, and then Giants, Yankees, and it does tend to align a lot more than it doesn't. And Queens is like the perfect example because the Mets are out there, so you have like Mets, Jets, and then you see a lot of more Giants, Yankees, and kind of other parts of Brooklyn, Manhattan, Jersey, Staten, kind of thing. But there's plenty of mixing everywhere. It's not as hard of a line with Giants and Jets as it is Yankees and Mets.
Okay, and what about when we get up to like Newark or even out to like Nutley? Is it are we finally in the Giant stronghold? In this house, Tommy DeVito is a hero.
I noticed you picked the Italian enclaves of Nutley. Yeah, Tommy DeVito, no longer a Giant, I don't think.
uh, yeah,
But
didn't
yeah,
make
I
the
mean,
cut.
there's numerous buses that you'll see in the Giants tailgate. School buses that have been painted blue. They have sausage and peppers at the back, and they're from Nutley.
Yes. So for folks, this is a podcast episode with two Italians, one from New Jersey, one from New York, who love the New York Giants. Tommy DeVito did not make the final roster cuts, but um, as Italian men, we could be pathological about Tommy DeVito's abilities as a starting quarterback. We're afforded that. Honorary Italian Billy Joel, raised in the Jet stronghold of Long Island. Does Long Island hegemony in the form of Billy Joel have more of a hold in North Jersey than the Jets do, or do the Jets have more of a hold
I think the Jets have more of a hold. Uh,
or
if you're
competition?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, Billy Joel's big, but he's not. He can sell out the Garden. I'd be curious if he could sell out Giant Stadium. Um, yeah, I don't know. Whereas obviously the Jets do, and they have like a little bit more history there. Um, but you never know.
So yeah, so is there as much of a competitive streak with like the Jersey? You got Bruce Springsteen, the E Street Band. I don't know, Bon Jovi is pretty big there in the '80s, '90s. Is there a competitive streak with who's viewed as like the New York bands, as you would with like I don't know Giants versus Eagles fans?
I mean, I don't think Bruce or Billy Joel have a personal rivalry,
No,
or Bon Jovi and Billy Joel do. I mean, Bruce and Billy have played together a bunch, right? I think Bruce
yeah.
showed up at one of his last Madison Square Garden things. I think there's definitely a fandom rivalry, just because there's always a New York New Jersey rivalry, because
Yeah.
New Jersey's got its perpetual chip on its shoulder, right? Like we're always thought of as the joke state, and the endless butts of different jokes. So the fact that we have Bruce, and in our opinion or fact, is greater than Billy Joel, I think that leads to some fanhood rivalries for sure.
What about when Billy Joel came out with that 1983 banger "Allentown," right on the border of New Jersey? Or Bruce fans being like, "Hey, what you're stepping on our turf here." I'm trying to stoke a rivalry. Um, yeah, but yeah, Bruce Springsteen uh, sing a lot of classic songs about the changing of uh, the changing of demographics due to post-industrialization, and factories closing. Yeah, Billy Joel came out with one too in the early '80s. But so I was wondering, I was trying to stoke it, but at the same time, I feel like something really interesting you observe in your book about the changing audiences in Asbury Park, and as that went through a bunch of changes, in your oral history there. What was like really interesting to you in all those interviews you did with people from Asbury Park and from the Stone Pony?
About like the how the audience has changed, and how the people have
Yeah,
changed.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's kind of been the story of Asbury Park, and one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was because I thought the Stone Pony offered a pretty fascinating window into the history of this small town that's experienced so many changes. So, when Bruce and everyone was having run of the town, it was a blue collar town that was on its way down but hadn't bottomed out yet. And by the '90s, when Bruce is in LA, there's no more E Street Band. Um, Punk is really taking hold, and alternative, like the town bottoms out really hard. And that was kind of when I first discovered Asbury the town, not necessarily its place in like music or in Springsteen lore. And seeing that, and remembering all the kind of characters that weren't even in the punk shows that I would go see at the Pony or Convention Hall, but like that would kind of be outside, and the kind of unease we felt going in. And then fast forwarding that 15 years to, kind of what Asbury looked like in the mid 2010s, and gleaming apartment buildings and fancy restaurants and breweries and family friendly playgrounds and all that stuff. You almost couldn't believe it. And those, people go to the shows around there. So it's kind of like the Pony's always, I've always described it as like the beating heart of Asbury Park. And with that, the heart kind of changes as the town did. And you can clearly see those delineations through the different eras, that the town went through.
Yeah, and you speak to a lot of people from the town. You also have a forward from Bruce Springsteen for the book. Not a bad pull at all. How what was the most exciting, or not maybe not the most exciting, but like what was one like sort of thrilling thing that came out of that experience that was maybe cathartic for you?
I don't know about cathartic, but I mean, obviously, like getting a forward from an icon like Bruce is, you dream of those kind of moments. Um, but I think some of the most fun I had was doing the interviews with Bruce and his friends. and realizing how much they were like me and my friends, or like any group of Jersey guys, right? Like we all have nicknames. We all kind of rag on each other a lot. Like we have like the one house that we all default to. We have the same kind of music scene that we would all find ourselves in. Like it was really funny asking them to tell stories about each other. You know, Bruce remembering stealing Stevie's car as a joke, driving it down, going for like a joyride down the boardwalk with the bouncer, and how they were laughing about it, and Stevie like still being like, I don't remember that. Like it's the kind of hijinks that all of us in New Jersey would get into, because like, you know, it's not like you're out every night at some crazy club in New York City, or a jazz club, or you know, in some more rural town where you have to go far to meet each other. This was like the kind of life experience of New Jersey and what it was like growing up here. And so that was probably, if we're coming for something that's like close to cathartic, it was that kind of familiarity that I felt talking to Bruce and Stevie and Southside and the bouncers, and you know, Max Weinberg, about their Jerseydom, and realizing like, I, you know, that stayed true for decades up until my generation.
Yeah, and folks, check out once again. I don't want to go home. The oral history of the Stone Pony really takes you into a world that's like fun to hang in for over the course of that. The paperback's now out. You cover political campaigns, issue favorability for the two major parties. Do you believe the median New Jersey voter is into all four of Bruce, Billy, Bon Jovi, and Frank? Are they all showing up on the playlist at a Labor Day cookout in the tri-state?
So I think, yes, I actually do think yes. I do think the unassailables is definitely Frank Sinatra. You know, even if you're not in the mood, you're like, ah, it's Frank. You know, and Bruce is mostly like that. There are some people who like, you know, surprisingly, I guess maybe if they're not immediately into it because of the omnipresence of it, can be kind of, um, you know, this isn't my thing. But for the most part, uh, Bruce and Frank are going to be on any playlist in the state, on any wedding bands, you know, list of songs they can play on the state. You're going to hear that kind of any festive gathering, radio station, anything. And then Bon Jovi and Billy for sure too, but probably aren't in the same kind of universal echelon um, in New Jersey. But you know, I mean, we're talking about all A-listers, all megastars, right? So it's like, okay, if the floor is 90%, who's in 98%? And that's going to be probably Bruce and Frank, whereas the others might be in like 90, but you're still in 90%.
Yeah, but early in the '70s, um, did it take time to come this state to come to fruition? Of course, the Bruce Springsteen, the E Street Band becomes really big by like what was it, '75. In the oral history, going into the early '70s, someone mentioned that at the mob joints, they weren't that interested in the early '70s Asbury Park scene, that kind of music being played there. I'm guessing that was more Frank and Dean. When you get further northwest, into the upper reaches of Jersey, does it feel like you're getting into a did it at least or when you went back in time for the story, did it feel like you were getting into a different music territorially, or a different territory musically once you got further away from Asbury Park, and Asbury Park had its like very much own separate thing going on?
100%. Although this is a topic of debate in Jersey for two reasons. So there's the idea of the sound of Asbury Park. It's something that, you know, journalists back in the early '70s and mid '70s were writing about, and it's that Springsteen, Southside, Stevie Van Zandt vibe of like a bar band with horn arrangements, right? So if it's Bruce, it's a saxophone with Clarence. If it's Southside, it's the three part horn section with trumpet, trombone, and I guess and sax, um, and mixing that with rock and R&B and soul, and like that's the sound of Asbury Park according to the journalists of the time and some observers. But like when as you'll see in the book, I asked like everyone from Gary Talent and Bruce and Southside to the bartenders, like, what was the sound of Asbury Park, and they had varying degrees of like it was nonsense or it's what we were doing or it's what Johnny was doing. So there's like that sound. Then there's like the Jersey Shore bar band sound, and that's very raw. That's still influenced with a decent amount of R&B, and that you could find, if you could ever find a band that was breaking out of the top 40, you go down to Manasquan. Maybe they had it at the Osprey, the Inkwell. There's a bunch of bars, and they had the Student Prince, the Green Parrot, that all had this kind of like Jersey bar band sound. And that was like a definitive thing that at least, reporters at the time wrote about. And if you were to try and step out and say, like, what's the Jersey sound? Then you're getting into all sorts of mixes, right? There are loungy singers in the north and maybe close to Hoboken that, Max Weinberg was talking about having to play with. There's oldies circuits, all that kind of stuff. So there's different stratospheres, but I think it's like you kind of get more and more geographically centered. In Asbury Park, that's where you'll get like a little bit more definition.
And when you move in the book, they talk about how you get further down the Jersey Shore, you have different, very distinctly different places and even different music scenes. Well, as you get further south and west in the Garden State, when do we start seeing predominantly Eagles fans sprouting up? I know you mentioned Freehold being like one of the last giant strongholds, or where it starts to split 50-50. Is that, I'll say as a Giants fan, is that effectively contained to the immediate Philly suburbs where it's mostly Eagles fans?
I mean, if you want to talk like majority, like strict majority Eagles fans, it's South Jersey. Um, I mean, this is like a New Jersey debate, and people will like fight me on this. Some people want to say it's 195 and like the highway south of there. In my opinion, being a Giants biased person, it's the Atlantic City Expressway and below, and maybe like a little bit above there, but it doesn't really get that far north where you're predominantly in Eagles country, right? Like if you were to go to Wildwood or Ocean City, New Jersey, it's going to be 90-10 Eagles fans or 80-20. But, if you're on LBI on the Jersey Shore or in, like we were saying, Freehold or Lambertsville, or even like Trenton, it's not going to be that definitive. It might be slightly more, but there's definitely a greater mix. So they don't, in my opinion, again, I'm biased here and people disagree with me vigorously. But the dominance that the Giants and Jets have of Northern Jersey and the much more people there is way outweighs what the Eagles are able to claim in the southern part of the state.
And the E Street Band would take part in their own sports in Jersey a little bit. I think you mentioned they played against the Stone Pony. We had a softball rivalry going.
This is one of my favorite parts of the book. So the Stone Pony staff, so the bartenders, the bouncers, different people affiliated with the bar would play pickup softball games against Springsteen, E Street Band members, and like other musicians in the area. So from some of the other local bands or like people in E Street world. So like Bruce's, I think it was his booking agent, was like a semi-pro player. So he was the ringer pitcher who could pitch, fast pitch softball and strike out everyone. But the games were absolutely hilarious. And everyone was like pretty good. Like Clarence Clemens could apparently like, knock the hell out of the ball, constantly hitting balls over. Like there was no, immediate fence or something. So just into the woods. Bruce was like a really quick second baseman, good defensively, could hit well, was fast. There's some funnier characters like there's a guy, Tony Amato, who played in some local bands. His nickname is Botchagaloop. And he would dress like a leprechaun sometimes just because he thought that's what baseball players dress like. And then the pony, had some like mammoth bouncers, like huge 6'8", 280 pounds, pure muscle, who could also like smack the hell out of the ball, but were a force on the base paths. One of them was the founder, Jack Roig. And he told me a story like he knocked a really good double over the shortstop, like kind of split the outfielders rolling. And he's like, probably round it, maybe even into a triple, but he rounds first base, coming in hard. And then he sees Bruce standing at second base, like waiting for the relay throw. And he thinks to himself, like, a terrible headline would be the owner of the Stone Pony breaks Bruce Springsteen's leg before the River Tour. Maybe
Go
I
Feds
should
up,
slow
dude.
up. Yeah. And just take first. And so he did. And, there's all sorts of pictures in the book and stories from those games. And they were just something special.
Yeah, that'd be like rolling into the quarterback's leg during training camp. Uh,
Yep. No Theismann
uh,
injuries here.
no, no, no. And now going way further south in South Jersey, down at last question here, down at Tampa, February '09, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band play the Super Bowl halftime show, and since it's halftime, the New York Giants are technically still defending champs, having felled the Patriots 18-1 the year prior. Sopranos had just wrapped with the belt for greatest to ever do it on television here early in the golden age. It seemed relatively indisputable at that point. Now Bruce tapped for the Super Bowl halftime show. I assume you didn't run an errand during this one and were instead basking in the glow of New Jersey cultural dominance.
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure I remember watching that at my friend's house, and like his dad brought speakers like special for the home theater system for that Super Bowl, but really it was for like Bruce playing the halftime show. So it was a moment. And the thing that like I think is incredible about that, in terms of like Springsteen history, is it was a big moment for him, gets to play the Super Bowl halftime show, it's big Americana. After that, he writes this essay for his website about that experience. And it was kind of the first time that he really like voiced himself in like prose, not songwriting, but allowing himself to write. And he later said that like writing that essay on the Super Bowl performance is like what gave him the idea and the confidence that he could pull off an autobiography, which is one of the greatest, like, I think it's the greatest autobiography I've ever read. Certainly one of the most important books in music history. And so all of that dates back to this halftime show.